We count on modern medicine to keep us healthy, and we count on modern agriculture to keep us fed. But what if the very chemicals we use to grow our food are actually making our most important medicines weaker? Today, we're going to explore this really surprising and frankly critical link between pesticides and the rise of superbugs. So let's just jump right into the big question for today. It almost sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? What if the everyday fight against weeds and pests on our farms is accidentally creating this huge, invisible threat inside our hospitals? Well, a whole lot of evidence is starting to suggest that's exactly what is happening.
Okay, so to really get this connection, we first have to get a clear picture of the enemy we're already fighting, this massive, global crisis of antimicrobial resistance. Let's start with the basics. Antimicrobial resistance, or AMR for short, is basically what happens when germs, like bacteria and fungi, evolve. They develop these new defenses against the very drugs we designed to kill them. So this makes common infections way harder to treat, and in some cases, pretty much impossible. And look, this is not some problem for the future. Back in 2019, antimicrobial resistance was the direct cause of 1.27 million deaths around the world. To put that in perspective, that's more deaths than from HIV/AIDS or malaria in that same year. The human cost is staggering, and it's happening right now.
And if that's not alarming enough, the economic cost is just, well, mind-blowing. The projections show that by the year 2050, AMR could tack on over $1 trillion to our global healthcare bill. So this isn't just a health crisis, it's a massive economic crisis waiting to happen.
For years, when we've talked about AMR, the focus has really been on one thing: the overuse of antibiotics in people and in farm animals. And that is absolutely a huge piece of the puzzle. But what if there's another major driver that we've mostly been missing?
Right. So, for the longest time, all eyes were on this one side of the equation: how we use antibiotics in clinics and on farms. But now, we're realizing there's this second, sort of hidden driver: the enormous amounts of agricultural pesticides we spray on our crops. And that's the connection we're really digging into today.
And this isn't just a hunch. The research is becoming really clear on this. Scientists are now confirming that pesticides aren't just sitting there in the soil. They are actively putting pressure on bacteria, basically forcing them to evolve, and in that process, making them way more resilient against our most important medicines.
And we're not talking about some obscure, rarely used chemical either. The problem involves some of the most common agricultural products out there. We're talking herbicides that kill weeds, fungicides that fight plant diseases, and even certain insecticides. They are all part of this story. So how in the world does a chemical that's designed to kill a weed or a fungus end up making a bacterium resistant to a life-saving antibiotic? Well, the science behind it is pretty fascinating. The key here is to think of pesticides as a kind of chemical stressor. They don't even have to kill the bacteria directly. Just by making the environment hostile, they push bacteria to turn on their survival mode. It's almost like a boot camp that trains them for the much tougher fight against our antibiotics. And the defenses they come up with are incredible. For instance, they can turn on these things called efflux pumps. Think of them as tiny pumps that physically kick antibiotics out of the cell before they can do any harm. They can also mutate their genes so the antibiotic's target changes. It's like changing the locks on a door so the key doesn't work anymore. And maybe the most amazing part? They can share these new tricks with other bacteria by passing genes back and forth. They're basically handing out a cheat sheet for survival.
This all leads to this really critical idea called co-selection. So imagine a bacterium develops one of those efflux pumps to protect itself from a herbicide in a field. Well, it turns out that same exact pump is also really good at kicking out a specific antibiotic. So by spraying for weeds, we are unintentionally co-selecting for bacteria that are also resistant to our medicines. It's a 2-for-1 deal, but not in a good way.
And this isn't just happening in a lab or in one isolated farm field. The consequences of this are actually rippling out across our entire environment and all of our global systems.
See, these chemicals don't just vanish after they're used. Their residues stick around in the soil, they get washed into our rivers and lakes. This creates this huge environmental pool where these newly toughened up bacteria can thrive and multiply and eventually find their way onto our food and into the global food chain.
So what that means is, this problem has grown way beyond the four walls of a hospital. When our most essential medicines start failing, it directly threatens things like global food security and economic stability. This is a fundamental issue that really touches every single part of modern life.
Now, I know this all sounds incredibly daunting, But the same science that uncovered this problem is also pointing us toward the solutions. And it's all about working smarter. The way forward really starts with rethinking the very basics of how we grow our food. The goal is to shift from just reacting to problems with chemicals to being proactive, to designing our farms to be healthier and more resilient from the very beginning. And a key strategy for this is something called integrated pest management, or IPM. It's not about getting rid of pesticides completely. It's about seeing them as a tool of last resort, the final option in a big toolbox, instead of the first and only thing you reach for. The IPM approach is actually a pretty logical step-by-step process. First, you monitor and diagnose to figure out what the real problem is. Then, you focus on prevention, using things like naturally resistant crops or rotating what you plant. After that, you can use biological controls, like beneficial insects, and only then, if all of that isn't enough, do you consider a very careful, targeted chemical intervention. So this approach is part of a much bigger strategy. We need to cut down our overall chemical use in farming, period. We have to get way better at tracking AMR in our soil and water. We need to make sure factories aren't just dumping these chemicals into the environment. And maybe most importantly, we have to make sure that everyone, from farmers to policymakers to us, understands what's at stake.
And that really brings us to the final and most critical question. The challenge ahead is huge, no doubt about it, but it's not impossible. It's going to demand a new way of thinking. One where we understand that the health of our soil, our plants, and our own bodies aren't separate issues. They're all part of one interconnected system. And figuring out how to balance that system, well, that's a choice we're all going to have to make.